Emma Carter stood still in front of the full-length mirror in her childhood bedroom, her heart pounding, not just from excitement but from an unshakable, nameless anxiety. Her wedding dress, pristine and white, hugged her figure perfectly, the delicate lace catching the soft light filtering through the window. This was the day she had dreamed of since she was a little girl, the day she would embark on a new journey with the man she loved most, Jake. Everything was perfect, at least according to the plan, but something wasn't right. At her feet, Oliver, her 11-year-old Labrador, lay still, his deep brown eyes locked onto hers. He was never the loud or overly energetic type, but he had never been this silent either. Normally, the mere mention of Jake's name would send his tail wagging as he rushed to share in her happiness. But today, Oliver simply watched her, his gaze filled with something she couldn't quite understand. Emma knelt down, gently running her fingers through his soft fur, the same fur she had buried her face in during the loneliest nights of her youth. "What's wrong, Ollie? Today's a big day. Aren't you excited?" Oliver didn't react the way he usually did. He merely shifted slightly, his ears twitching faintly, but his eyes remained solemn, unreadable. "Emma, sweetheart, are you ready?" Her mother's voice drifted in from the hallway. Emma took a deep breath, forcing herself to push aside the unease settling in her chest. "Oliver is probably just sensing all the excitement and chaos of the day," she reassured herself. Leaning down, she pressed a soft kiss to the top of his head. "Come on, Ollie, today's an important day." But as she turned to leave, Oliver suddenly rose to his feet, not with his usual eager energy, but with slow, unsteady movements. His legs trembled beneath him, as though it took every ounce of his strength just to stand. Emma froze. A wave of anxiety washed over her, stronger this time. She looked down at him, and for a fleeting moment she saw it. His breathing was heavier than usual, his body weaker than it had ever been. But there was no time to dwell on it. She brushed away the fear and gently encouraged him forward. They were going to the church. Emma sat in the back of the wedding car, her gown cascading around her in elegant waves, each delicate lace detail trembling slightly with her unsteady breaths. The familiar streets leading to St. Patrick's Church stretched out before her. Yet today, they felt unfamiliar, longer, heavier. Not because of wedding jitters, not because of excitement, but because of the growing weight in her heart. Oliver, her faithful companion of 11 years, lay curled up at her feet, his head resting heavily in her lap. It wasn't the relaxed, contented posture she was used to. He was shifting restlessly, his body uneasy, and every so often, a soft whimper escaped his throat, so faint that only Emma, over the quiet hum of the car's engine, could hear. She ran a soothing hand over his golden fur, her fingers tracing along his back in slow, reassuring strokes. "What's wrong, Ollie?" she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "You've never hated car rides before." Oliver didn't lift his head. He simply nestled in closer, pressing against her as if trying to tell her something she wasn't quite ready to hear. Oliver didn't wag his tail like he always did. He didn't perk up at the sight of passing cars or press his nose eagerly against the window, anticipating an exciting adventure. Instead, he shifted closer to her, his warm breath brushing against her hand, each inhale slower, heavier than usual. A chill ran down Emma's spine. For weeks, she had been so consumed with wedding preparations that she had brushed aside the subtle changes. She had noticed Oliver slowing down, the way he moved more carefully, how he sometimes left his food untouched. But she had reassured herself. He's just getting older. He's probably just feeling overwhelmed by all the commotion. But now, as she watched him lying still on the car floor, his chest rising and falling in laboured breaths, a terrible thought flashed through her mind. I was wrong. The unease in Emma's chest swelled into full-fledged fear. Oliver's breathing wasn't just slow. It was ragged, strained. Looking closer, she noticed a faint tremor rippling through his legs. Something so subtle she might have missed it if she weren't watching him so closely. "Emma, are you okay?" Jenny's voice drifted from the front seat, light and cheerful, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside Emma's mind. "Oliver's not well," Emma said, trying to keep her voice steady, though her eyes never left her dog. Jenny turned around, concern flickering across her face as she took in Oliver's still form. He looks a little tired. Maybe it's just all the excitement. He's getting older after all. He probably just needs to rest. That should have comforted her. It didn't. Emma swallowed hard, her fingers tightening against Oliver's soft fur. He's not just tired. He was weaker than she had ever seen him, and the weight of that realization pressed down on her harder than any wedding day nerves ever could. The car rolled down the tree-lined street, leading to St. Patrick's Church. Outside the window, pristine white ribbons fluttered along the entrance and flowers bloomed in perfect harmony, painting the scene like a dream. Everything was set. Everything was waiting for her. Then, just as the car came to a stop, Oliver suddenly pushed himself up, his legs wobbling in a terrifying way. He tried to stand, but the moment he did, his body betrayed him. His legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed sideways against Emma. "Oliver!" she cried out, catching him instinctively, her arms wrapping around his trembling body. Her heart pounded wildly, breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Oliver was shaking, his breathing growing rapid and unsteady. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. The car door swung open, and Emma's mother stood outside, her face glowing with excitement. But the moment she saw Emma's stricken expression, her smile faltered, replaced by a deep frown. "Emma, what's wrong?" Emma didn't hear her. She couldn't hear anything. There was only one thought pounding through her mind. He needs a doctor. Right now. The wedding car had just pulled up in front of St. Patrick's Church. The morning air was crisp and fresh, the sound of church bells ringing gently through the golden sunlight filtering through the ancient oak trees. The entire scene was breathtaking. Everything was exactly as it should be for the most important day of her life. Or at least, it was supposed to be. Just as Emma lifted her gown to step out of the car, Oliver suddenly stepped in front of her, blocking her path. She stopped, frowning at her loyal companion. "Ollie, come on. Everyone's waiting." But Oliver didn't move. He didn't wag his tail, didn't bounce excitedly at her side like he always did. Instead, he just stood there, his legs trembling beneath him, his breathing labored. Emma's stomach twisted. This wasn't just Oliver being clingy. He was stopping her. A deep, wrenching feeling gripped her chest as she crouched down, her eyes locking onto his. His breathing was heavy, his chest rising and falling too fast. And when she placed her hand gently on his back, she felt it, a subtle tremor beneath his soft golden fur. "Oliver!" Her voice cracked. She reached out, trying to gently guide him aside, but instead, he pressed against her leg, leaning into her, as if using every last bit of strength he had left just to stay upright. A hushed murmur spread through the waiting guests. Her mother, Jenny, even the photographer, all of them were beginning to notice something was wrong. "What's going on?" Jenny stepped closer, her voice laced with concern. Emma didn't respond. Her hands were trembling as she stroked Oliver's back, feeling the rapid, unsteady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her fingertips. Then, barely above a whisper, she said the words that made the reality sink in. "He's not okay." Jenny knelt beside Oliver, pressing her hand gently against his chest. Almost immediately, her eyes snapped up to meet Emma's, filled with alarm. "His heart is racing too fast," she whispered. Emma's breath hitched. Without a second thought, she yanked up the layers of her wedding gown and reached into the small pocket sewn into her sleeve. Her fingers fumbled as she pulled out her phone, her hands shaking so much she almost dropped it. She didn't need to think. Her instincts took over. She dialed the number she knew by heart. "Riverside Veterinary Clinic. This is Kate speaking. How can I—" "Kate, it's Emma," she gasped, her voice breaking. "Oliver, he's having trouble breathing. His heart is pounding, his legs are shaking, and he won't move. Please tell me. He's going to be okay, right?" A brief silence. Then Kate's tone shifted, calm but serious. "Emma, you need to bring him in now. Dr. Peterson is here. He can see Oliver as soon as you get here." Emma's pulse pounded in her ears as she lowered the phone, staring down at Oliver. Then she lifted her gaze, scanning the churchyard. Her fiancé, Jake, stood at the altar inside, waiting for her. Guests filled the pews, anticipation thick in the air. Her mother stood by the entrance, adjusting the delicate lace on Emma's veil just moments ago. Everything was ready for her. But Oliver wasn't. A gentle hand rested on her shoulder. She turned and met her father's eyes, full of quiet understanding. "Go," he said softly. "We can figure everything else out later. But Oliver, he's been with you through everything. He needs you now." Tears welled in Emma's eyes, but she didn't hesitate. She tightened her grip on Oliver's leash, gathered her gown in one hand, and ran. Jenny was right behind her, but Emma barely registered anything except the weight of Oliver beside her, struggling to keep up, his body pressing into her as if he was using her strength to keep moving. She didn't know what awaited them at the clinic. She didn't know if she'd return to the church today, or if there would even be a wedding at all. But one thing was clear. Oliver wouldn't go through this alone. Emma stood frozen in the middle of the churchyard, the soft morning sunlight illuminating what should have been the most beautiful moment of her life. But she no longer noticed the flowers, the decorations, or the murmuring crowd. All she could see was Oliver, trembling, struggling to stay on his feet. Every time he tried to steady himself, his legs faltered, his breath growing more labored. It was as if the weight of the world had suddenly become too much for him to carry. A lump formed in her throat. This wasn't just exhaustion. This was fear, not hers, his. And in that moment, she knew this wasn't about the wedding anymore. This wasn't about the perfect day she had planned. This was about him. And no matter what happened next, she wouldn't let him face it alone. Her father, Robert, placed a firm yet gentle hand on her shoulder. His eyes, calm and steady, held no trace of doubt, only certainty, only love. "Emma," he said softly, but with quiet conviction, "you already know what you have to do." His words weren't a suggestion. They weren't advice. They were a truth she had known in her heart all along. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked down at Oliver, her best friend, her protector, her constant. She had dreamed of this day for years, imagined every perfect detail. But in the end, none of it mattered. Not the flowers, not the dress, not the waiting crowd. What mattered was this, the love she had promised to cherish, not just for Jake, but for Oliver too. She took a shaky breath and nodded. She had made her choice, and it wasn't a sacrifice. It was love. Emma looked up, her vision blurred with unshed tears. Her voice trembled. "But the wedding, everyone is waiting." Her father's hand remained firm on her shoulder, grounding her. His voice was calm, unwavering. "The wedding can wait," he said simply. "But Oliver can't." Something inside Emma shifted, a truth she had always known but had never expected to face. Not today, not like this. Oliver had been there for everything. When she cried over her first heartbreak, when she packed up and left for college, when she moved into her first apartment. He was there when she met Jake, the first to welcome him into their lives. He had been a silent witness to every milestone, a constant in her ever-changing world. And now, when he needed her the most, could she really turn her back on him? A gentle touch on her other shoulder made her turn. Jake. He was still in his suit, still standing in the midst of their picture-perfect wedding scene, but there was no disappointment in his eyes, no frustration, no hesitation, just understanding. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly. "I already know what you're going to do." Emma searched his face, bracing herself for a trace of regret or sadness, but she found none, only the smallest of smiles and a quiet nod of encouragement. A tear finally slipped down her cheek, not from sorrow, but from certainty. She was making the right choice. She turned to Jenny. "Get the car. I need to get Oliver to the vet now." Jenny didn't hesitate. "Let's go." Emma's mother, initially stunned, quickly regained her composure. "I'll handle the guests. Don't worry about anything here." Everything blurred into motion. Emma barely felt the weight of her gown as she lifted it, focusing only on guiding Oliver toward the car. His steps were slow, deliberate, each one requiring more effort than the last. By the time she opened the car door, he hesitated. The simple act of climbing inside, a motion that had once been effortless, was now a challenge. Emma swallowed the lump in her throat and gently helped him in. As soon as she settled into the back seat, Oliver rested his heavy head on her lap, exhaling a slow, weary breath. She ran her fingers through his fur. feeling the faint rhythm of his breathing beneath her palm. "I'm here, Ollie," she whispered, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. Whatever came next, she would not let him face it alone. The car sped through the quiet streets, but to Emma, every second felt agonizingly slow. She sat in the back seat, her wedding gown pooling around her in a tangled mess of lace and silk. Not that she cared. Her mind was consumed by only one thing: Oliver, her arms wrapped around him, holding him close, as if somehow she could transfer her own strength into his weakening body. Her fingers trembled as they ran gently through his golden fur, desperately memorizing every familiar texture, every warmth that still lingered. Outside, the world blurred past the window, but inside, time had never felt more fragile. Oliver's breathing was still heavy, each labored inhale and exhale an invisible warning. He was no longer panting in panic. His breaths had slowed, becoming deep and burdensome. Emma tightened her hold around him, her voice barely a whisper. "You're going to be okay, Ollie. We're going to see Dr. Peterson. He'll help you, I promise." But deep down, she knew. She wasn't just trying to comfort Oliver. She was trying to convince herself. As the car screeched to a halt in front of a riverside veterinary clinic, the door was already open. Dr. Peterson and Kate, the clinic's head nurse, stood waiting. Their faces were serious, urgent. Jenny rushed to open the car door, but Emma didn't need help. She leaned down, carefully lifting Oliver in her arms. He felt heavier than ever, though she knew it wasn't his weight that had changed. It was the effort he had to put into everything now. This was the same dog who had once sprinted through parks, who had leapt onto the bed every morning to wake her up, who had never let exhaustion slow him down. Now, even the simple act of standing was too much. "Bring him inside, now," Dr. Peterson instructed, already leading them toward the emergency room. Emma sank into a chair as Oliver was gently placed on the examination table. Her eyes never left him. Kate pressed a stethoscope against Oliver's chest, listening intently. A moment later, she glanced up, voice barely above a whisper. "His heartbeat is irregular." Dr. Peterson's frown deepened as he scanned the ultrasound monitor. Emma didn't need to understand the readings to know something was wrong, horribly wrong. The tension in the room was suffocating. Minutes passed like hours. Then, finally, Dr. Peterson removed his gloves, sighed, and turned toward her. His voice was gentle, but the weight of his words hit like a crushing blow. "Emma, Oliver has advanced heart failure." The entire room seemed to fall silent. Emma blinked, as if doing so would wake her from this nightmare. No, that can't be right." Her voice cracked. "He was just tired. He was fine a few days ago." Dr. Peterson sat beside her, his expression soft with sympathy. "Heart disease in dogs is often silent until the later stages," he explained. "There are very few warning signs until it's already critical. His heart is weakening, and the difficulty breathing, that's from fluid building up around it." Emma shook her head, tears slipping down her face. She looked at Oliver, her Oliver, still lying on the table, his deep brown eyes gazing back at her. He wasn't confused. He wasn't scared. He knew. He had known all along. "Is there anything we can do?" she asked, voice raw but desperate with hope. Dr. Peterson exhaled softly, his voice steady but laced with sorrow. "We can't cure this, but we can manage his symptoms and make him as comfortable as possible." He hesitated, then met her gaze. "But Emma, we're talking months, not years." The words hit like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. Her body felt weightless, as if she were floating in a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Slowly, she lowered her forehead to Oliver's, her tears soaking into his golden fur. "You were trying to tell me, weren't you?" she whispered, voice breaking. "You knew you weren't okay. You stopped me because you needed me to see it." A weak but unmistakable movement brushed against her fingers. Oliver licked her hand, soft, reassuring. Even now, he was the one comforting her, just as he always had. Emma blinked away the tears, lifting her head, her breath steadying. If Oliver had spent his whole life loving her without hesitation, She would spend the rest of his making sure he never felt alone. She sat up straighter, gripping his paw in her hands, feeling the faint pulse beneath his worn pads. "Then we'll do everything we can to make sure he's okay," she said firmly. "I promised him. He's not going through this alone." Dr. Peterson nodded. "We'll start treatment immediately." As the nurse prepared the medication, Emma never let go of Oliver, never moved from his side. The pristine white of her wedding dress was now smudged with dirt and tears, but she didn't care. All that mattered was the dog resting his head in her lap, the one who had given her his whole life, asking for nothing in return. The door burst open. Jake stood there, still in his tuxedo, looking completely out of place in the sterile, fluorescent-lit clinic. But he didn't hesitate. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and dropped to his knees beside her. "I'm here," he said softly, taking her hand in his. "Are you okay?" Emma met his gaze, her own eyes shining with emotion. "No," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "Oliver, he doesn't have much time left." Jake squeezed her hand tighter. His face was filled with understanding, not a single trace of frustration or disappointment. Then suddenly, he smiled. "Then let's make sure he's here for something special." Emma blinked. "What do you mean?" Before he could answer, Jenny was already on the phone, pacing back and forth, speaking in hushed urgency. "The minister is still at the church. I'll ask him to come here," she said. Robert, her father, stepped forward, resting his hand on her shoulder with the same quiet strength he always carried. "We can have the wedding right here," he said. "There's no reason to wait." Emma felt her heart clench. There would be no grand aisle lined with candles, no perfectly arranged rows of guests, no elegant reception hall or first dance under twinkling lights. But none of that mattered anymore. Oliver would be here, and in the end, he had been part of every important moment of her life. How could he not be part of this one? Emma looked down at Oliver. His body was frail, his breath slow, but his eyes, those deep, knowing eyes, held nothing but love. He had been there for every important moment of her life. How could she let him go without witnessing the most joyful one of all? She swallowed the lump in her throat, turned to Jake, and, through the tears, through the whirlwind of emotions, she smiled. Her voice trembled, but her words were steady. "Yes, let's get married. Right now." Less than an hour later, the waiting room at Riverside Veterinary Clinic became an unexpected wedding chapel. The minister arrived, his robes as pristine as if he were standing inside the grandest church, despite the simple white walls and the faint scent of antiseptic in the air. Jenny had somehow managed to find a bouquet from a nearby flower shop, its petals still kissed with the morning dew. Their closest friends gathered in a small, intimate circle, creating a space that felt sacred, warm, and filled with love. And at the center of it all, Oliver. He lay on a soft blanket, a tiny bow tie fastened around his neck, the one Emma had picked out for him weeks ago, never expecting he would be wearing it here, in this moment. His eyes fluttered open, and despite his exhaustion, he watched her, unwavering. He knew this was important. He knew this was a moment he couldn't miss. Emma and Jake stood facing each other, hands intertwined. Emma could feel the steady pulse in Jake's palm, a silent promise that he would always be there, no matter what. The minister's voice was calm, full of warmth. "We gather here today, not in a grand cathedral, but in a place filled with love. Love not just between two people, but love that extends to a faithful companion who has given his whole heart, unconditionally." Emma's throat tightened. She stole a glance down at Oliver, feeling the weight of every moment they had shared, every walk in the park, every night he had curled beside her, every silent comfort he had given her without needing to say a word. This wasn't the wedding she had planned, but it was the wedding that truly mattered. Emma bit her lip, fighting back the wave of emotions threatening to spill over. This moment, this imperfect, beautiful, heart-wrenching moment, wasn't the one she had planned. It was something deeper, something real. When it came time to exchange vows, she turned to Jake, her gaze locking onto his. Her voice, though soft, carried the weight of her heart. "I once dreamed of the perfect wedding, but today I realize that perfection isn't about where we stand. It's about the hand I'm holding and the friend lying beside us." Her breath hitched as she glanced down at Oliver. his body still, yet his presence unwavering. "Jake, I promise to love you the way Oliver has taught me, unconditionally, without hesitation, and never letting go." A single tear escaped down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. Jake's lips parted in a soft smile, his eyes shining with absolute devotion. He squeezed her hands, his own voice unsteady as he spoke. "Emma, from the moment I met you, I knew you had the biggest heart of anyone I'd ever known. You love without question, you care without reason. I've watched you love Oliver the way I can only hope to be loved one day." He took a shaky breath, his grip tightening. "And today, I vow to love you the way you loved him, with my whole heart, always." The room fell silent, not because of the setting, not because of the simplicity of the moment, but because love had never felt more profound than it did right now. Tears streamed down Emma's face, but they were not tears of sorrow. The minister smiled gently. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Jake leaned in, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to Emma's lips. The room erupted into quiet applause, a mixture of hushed sobs and warm smiles from those who had just witnessed something far greater than a traditional wedding, a testament to love in its purest form. And then, as if on cue, Oliver lifted his head ever so slightly. He took in a slow breath and, with what little energy he had left, let out a small, soft woof. A blessing, a farewell, a quiet acknowledgement that he had been there for this moment. The entire room laughed through their tears. Emma bent down, wrapping her arms gently around him, pressing her cheek to his soft fur. "Thank you, Ollie," she whispered, "for always being here." After that extraordinary day, Emma and Jake no longer measured time in days or weeks. Instead, they measured it in moments. They adjusted everything, their routines, their priorities, their very way of living, to make sure Oliver was never alone, never felt forgotten. His bed was placed right next to theirs, so that each night, Emma could reach out and feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, the familiar warmth of his fur. Once he had leapt effortlessly onto their bed, wedging himself proudly between them. Now, he simply lay there, eyes filled with the same quiet devotion that had never faded. They no longer travelled far, no longer spent nights in fancy restaurants. Instead, their most cherished moments became the simple ones, sitting with Oliver on the porch in the golden evening light, watching the world pass by, feeling the breeze ruffle his aging coat. Time was slipping away, but they wouldn't waste a second of it. Each morning, though his legs no longer carried him with the same youthful energy, Oliver still tried. He would slowly make his way to the park near their home, the very same park where, 11 years ago, he had bounded toward Emma for the first time, tail wagging wildly, as if declaring that they belonged to each other. Now, when the journey became too much, Jake carried him on his back. It was a quiet ritual between them, Jake lifting Oliver gently, securing him in his arms, allowing him to feel the breeze, to watch the world he had loved for so long pass by. And Oliver, nestled against Jake's shoulders, would close his eyes, content at night. Emma sat beside him, her fingers combing through his soft fur, her voice a whisper in the stillness. She told him stories, stories of them, of the first time she saw him at the shelter, a scrappy, eager puppy with eyes that held the entire world, of the day he curled up beside her when she cried over her first heartbreak, of the way he had circled Jake curiously that afternoon, as if trying to decide whether he was good enough for her, of the summers when he had raced through the fields, chasing the fading sunlight, his joy boundless. He no longer reacted the way he once had, but his eyes never left hers, as if he was memorizing every word, every memory, tucking them away, holding them close. Then came a quiet spring evening, so still, so weightless, as if the world itself was waiting for something sacred. The sky was endless and clear, the air carrying the gentle hush of a season just beginning. And in that silence, Oliver didn't try to move. He didn't shift his weight, didn't attempt to lift his head. He simply rested against her, his breathing slow, deep, as if he was savoring her warmth one last time. They didn't speak. They simply held each other, surrounding Oliver with all the love they had left to give. Outside, a soft spring breeze drifted through the window, carrying with it the warmth of every sunlit afternoon they had spent together, every joyful moment they had shared. And as Emma pressed her forehead against Oliver's one last time, she understood. Even though he was gone, his love would never leave them. A year had passed since Oliver took his final breath, yet his presence lingered in every quiet corner of their home. His old bed remained beside the fireplace, untouched, as if he might return at any moment to curl up in its folds. Mornings were the hardest. Emma still found herself glancing toward the foot of the bed, waiting for the familiar sound of his paws tapping against the wooden floor. But the house was quieter now, too quiet. They never rushed to fill the space he left behind. His absence was a wound that time could not fully heal, but it was also a reminder of love, of loyalty, of the gift he had given them for over a decade. Oliver could never be replaced, but the love he left behind, that love could be given again. And that was why, today, Emma and Jake stood outside Riverside Animal Shelter, the very place where, more than 10 years ago, Emma had met Oliver for the first time. "Are you sure?" Jake asked softly, his fingers lacing through hers, his grip warm and steady. Emma nodded, drawing in a deep breath. "There's never a perfect time to love someone new," she murmured. "If we wait, a dog out there might be waiting too, one who needs us now." With that, they stepped inside. The familiar sounds of the shelter washed over her. The soft clanking of kennel doors, the occasional bark, the quiet shuffling of paws against concrete floors. Hopeful eyes peered at them from behind metal bars, tails wagging with quiet anticipation. A middle-aged shelter worker with a kind smile approached them. "What kind of dog are you looking for?" Emma glanced around, then met the woman's gaze with quiet certainty. "An older dog, one that needs a home." The woman's smile widened. "I think I have the perfect match for you." She led them to the last kennel at the far end of the hall. Inside, a golden retriever, old but dignified, lay on a worn blanket. His head rested on his front paws, his deep brown eyes watching them with quiet curiosity. His name was written on the nameplate outside his kennel, Duke, age 10 years. "Duke has been here for 3 months now," the woman explained. "His family had to move into a nursing facility and couldn't take him with them. He's gentle, incredibly sweet, but most people come looking for younger dogs." Emma knelt down in front of the kennel, extending a cautious hand through the bars. Duke hesitated, then slowly, deliberately, pushed himself up onto his feet. He took careful, measured steps toward her, lowering his head as if he had learned to expect very little from strangers. But when he pressed his nose softly into her palm, Emma felt something familiar, something unspoken, yet deeply understood. A quiet trust, a silent exchange of hope. Jake crouched beside her, reaching out to scratch behind Duke's ears. "Hey there, buddy," he said gently. Duke looked up at them, his soft brown eyes full of something Emma couldn't quite put into words. Then, after a moment, he let out a long, quiet sigh. Not of exhaustion, not of sadness, but of acceptance, as if he finally knew his waiting was over. Emma swallowed the lump in her throat and turned to the shelter worker, her voice unwavering. "We'd like to take him home." On his first night home, Duke didn't run, didn't explore in excitement like a puppy would. Instead, he took slow, deliberate steps through the apartment, his nose twitching as he took in the unfamiliar scents, as if trying to memorize every inch of his new world. Then he spotted it. By the fireplace, Oliver's old bed was still there. Duke hesitated, standing still for a long moment. Then, with quiet understanding, he lowered himself onto the familiar cushion, curling up as though it had always been his. Emma and Jake exchanged a glance, their hearts aching, not in sadness, but in gratitude. Jake wrapped an arm around Emma's shoulders, his voice soft. "Maybe Oliver sent him to us." Emma blinked back tears. a small smile breaking through the emotion in her chest. She stepped forward, kneeling beside Duke, her hand settling gently on his back. "Welcome home, Duke." Duke let out a slow breath, then nuzzled his head into her lap. It was a simple action, one that carried so much meaning. And in that moment, Emma understood. Duke wasn't Oliver, and he didn't have to be, because love is not about replacing. Love is about continuing. And though Oliver was no longer there, he had left behind the greatest legacy of all, a heart that was still open, still willing to love, despite knowing that one day it would have to say goodbye again. Every year, as autumn painted the trees in golden hues, Emma and Jake didn't celebrate their anniversary with lavish parties or expensive dinners. There was no champagne, no extravagant gifts. Instead, they spent that day in a place that had changed their lives forever, Riverside Animal Shelter. Because after losing Oliver, they had realized something. Love isn't measured by perfect moments. It's found in sacrifice, in compassion, in choosing to show up, even when it hurts. It was what Oliver had taught them, simply by being in their lives. And now, it was a love they wanted to keep sharing. On the first anniversary after Oliver's passing, Emma woke earlier than usual. Sunlight filtered softly through the curtains, casting a golden glow over the room. She knew today wasn't just about celebrating their marriage. Today was about remembering Oliver. When she stepped into the kitchen, Jake was already awake. He stood by the counter, pouring coffee, but beside him, a large bag of dog food, a box of new toys, and a warm blanket sat waiting. He turned, offering her a gentle smile. "Ready?" he asked. Emma felt the tightness in her chest loosen just a little. She nodded, a warmth filling her heart. Always. They drove to Riverside Animal Shelter, the same place where, a year before, they had met Duke, the dog who had walked into their lives when they needed him most. But today wasn't about Duke. It wasn't even about Oliver. Today was about all the other dogs still waiting. The ones overlooked because they were too old, too quiet, too scarred from a past they hadn't chosen. The ones still hoping for someone to walk through the door and see them. Just like Emma had once seen Oliver. Just like they had seen Duke. And as they stepped into the shelter, their arms full of gifts, but their hearts full of something even greater, Emma knew. Oliver's love hadn't ended the day he left. It was still here, still living, still finding new ways to be shared. As they stepped into the shelter, they were greeted by wagging tails and hopeful eyes. The older dogs, those who were no longer young, no longer fast, yet still carried hearts longing to be loved, stood there, waiting for someone to choose them. Emma knelt beside a senior greyhound, his once vibrant coat now streaked with silver. She reached out, running her fingers gently over his head, feeling the faint tremor in his breathing. "Hey there," she whispered. "Did you know, a year ago today, I said goodbye to my best friend." Her throat tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "And he taught me that love never ends. It just finds new ways to be given again." The greyhound sighed softly, pressing his head into her touch, his eyes fluttering shut with quiet trust. And in that moment, she knew Oliver's love was still here. From that day forward, every year on their anniversary, Emma and Jake returned to Riverside Shelter, not just to donate, but to spend time with the dogs that had been overlooked, with the ones who waited, just like Oliver once had. They walked them, they played with them, they told them stories about Oliver, about Duke, about the love that had shaped their lives. And Duke, now older himself, walked beside them, a living reminder that love has the power to heal, even the hearts that had once been left behind. They couldn't take every dog home, but they could give them something just as precious: time, warmth, and the reminder that they were still worthy of love. On those anniversary nights, Emma and Jake didn't dress up or go out to fancy dinners. Instead, they sat together on their old wooden bench, Duke curled up at their feet, the soft glow of candlelight flickering in the evening breeze. Emma would look up at the sky, the stars stretching endlessly above them, and she would smile, because somewhere, Oliver was watching as the lesson he had left behind continued to be written, continued to be shared. Not everyone understood why they chose to celebrate their wedding day this way. But to Emma and Jake, there was no better way to honor Oliver, because the love he taught them was never about grand moments. It was not about perfection. It was about being there. It was about loving without hesitation. It was about showing up fully, completely, with your whole heart. And so they did. Year after year, love after love, for Oliver. When Emma looked back on the years that had passed, she realized that life rarely unfolded according to plan. Her wedding day had been nothing like the one she had envisioned. No grand cathedral, no hundreds of guests, no lavish reception. And yet, if given the chance to relive it, she wouldn't change a thing. Because on that day, she hadn't just gained a husband, she had Oliver, her loyal companion, the one who had stood by her through every chapter of her life, had been there to witness the moment she pledged forever to Jake. He had been there to feel the love they shared, to see the life they were building together. And though he couldn't stay forever, he had left this world in the arms of the people who loved him most, his heart at peace. Oliver was not just a dog. He was the greatest teacher of love, loyalty, and sacrifice. Oliver's love for Emma was never grand or extravagant. It was in the way he licked her hand when she was sad, in the way he curled up beside her at the end of a long day, in the way he watched over her as if she was his whole world. And it was through his quiet, unwavering devotion that Oliver had taught Emma and Jake the greatest lesson of all. Love is not about perfection, it's about presence. It's not found in the beautifully planned moments. It's in the way we choose to stay, even when life doesn't go as planned. Years later, whenever someone asked Emma and Jake about their wedding day, they never spoke of what didn't happen. They never talked about the postponed ceremony, or the church they never walked into, or the reception that never took place. Instead, they told the story of Oliver. They told of how he had stopped Emma that morning, as if reminding her that some things mattered more than a perfect plan. They told of how Jake had arrived at the clinic, dropped to his knees beside her, and never once questioned the choice she had made. Because love wasn't about standing at an altar, but about standing together in the moments that mattered most. They told of the tiny, intimate wedding in a veterinary waiting room, where vows were exchanged through tears and laughter, where their closest family and friends surrounded them, and where a faithful old dog lay at their feet, taking in every word. And they told of how Oliver, in his final moments, found just enough strength to let out one last, soft woof, his quiet blessing, his last gift to them. When Duke entered their lives, Emma and Jake realized something. Oliver had never really left. He had simply left his love behind, in a different form. In the way Duke curled up beside Emma on lazy mornings, soaking in the sunlight. In the way he rested his head in her lap when she was sad. In the way he walked beside Jake, his tail wagging gently in the breeze. Oliver's love was still there, woven into the fabric of their lives, in every moment of quiet companionship. Every year, on their anniversary, Emma and Jake didn't celebrate with extravagant parties. They didn't go to fancy restaurants or exchange expensive gifts. Instead, they returned to Riverside Animal Shelter, carrying warm blankets, bags of food, and gentle hands ready to offer comfort. Because some dogs, just like Oliver once had, were still waiting. Waiting for someone to see them. Waiting for someone to choose them. Waiting for love. And there was no better way to honor Oliver's legacy than to keep sharing the love he had taught them. Every year, on their anniversary, Emma and Jake didn't celebrate with extravagant parties. They didn't go to fancy restaurants or exchange expensive gifts. Instead, they returned to Riverside Animal Shelter, carrying warm blankets, bags of food, and gentle hands ready to offer comfort. Because some dogs, just like Oliver once had, were still waiting. Waiting for someone to see them, waiting for someone to choose them, waiting for love. And there was no better way to honor Oliver's legacy than to keep sharing the love he had taught them. They couldn't change the world, but they could change the world for someone. And that was Oliver's true legacy. Not just a dog, but a heart that had loved so deeply, so unconditionally, that its warmth never faded. It only found new ways to be shared. Love doesn't disappear. It transforms into new moments, into new lives touched, into new chances to give and to receive love, because real love never ends. Subscribe today if you love heartfelt stories of love, loyalty, and the lessons that truly matter in life. Then don't miss out on the content we share on this channel. Here you'll find touching stories about the unbreakable bond between humans and animals, heartwarming moments that inspire kindness and compassion, meaningful lessons that remind us to cherish life's simplest joys. Hit subscribe now to never miss a special story. Turn on notifications so you're always updated with our latest videos. One click can spread so much love. Thank you for being part of our journey.